Fanny Hill, by John Cleland. Part 6. Madam, if I have delayed the sequel of my history, it has been purely to allow myself a little breathing time, not without some hopes that, instead of pressing me to a continuation, you would have acquitted me of the task of pursuing a confession, in the course of which my self-esteem has so many wounds to sustain. I imagined, indeed, that you would have been cloyed and tired with uniformity of adventures and expressions, inseparable from a subject of this sort, whose bottom or groundwork being, in the nature of things, eternally one and the same, whatever variety of forms and modes the situations are susceptible of. There is no escaping a repetition of near the same images, the same figures, the same expressions, with this further inconvenience added to the disgust it creates, that the words joys, ardours, transports, ecstasies, and the rest of those pathetic terms so congenial to, so received in the practice of pleasure, flatten and lose much of their due spirit and energy by the frequency they indispensably recur with, in a narrative of which that practice professedly composes the whole basis. I must therefore trust to the candour of your judgment, for your allowing for the disadvantage I am necessarily under in that respect, and to your imagination and sensibility, the pleasing task of repairing it by their supplements, where my descriptions flag or fail. The one will readily place the pictures I present before your eyes, the other give life to the colours where they are dull, or worn with too frequent handling. What you say, besides, by way of encouragement, concerning the extreme difficulty of continuing so long in one strain, in a mean tempered with taste, between the revoltingness of gross, rank, and vulgar expressions, and the ridicule of mincing metaphors and affected circumlocutions, is so sensible, as well as good-natured, that you greatly justify me to myself for my compliance with a curiosity that is to be satisfied so extremely at my expense. Resuming now where I broke off in my last, I am in my way to remark to you that it was late in the evening before I arrived at my new lodgings, and Mrs. Cole, after helping me to range and secure my things, spent the whole evening with me in my apartment, where we supped together, in giving me the best advice and instruction with regard to this new stage of my profession I was now to enter upon, and passing thus from a private devotee to pleasure into a public one, to become a more general good, with all the advantages requisite to put my person out to use, either for interest or pleasure, or both. But then she observed, as I was a kind of new face upon the town, that it was an established rule, and part of trade, for me to pass for a maid, and to dispose of myself as such on the first good occasion, without prejudice, however, to such diversions as I might have a mind to in the interim, for that nobody could be a greater enemy than she was to the losing of time. That she would, in the meantime, do her best to find out a proper person, and would undertake to manage this nice point for me, if I would accept of her aid and advice to such good purpose that, in the loss of a fictitious maidenhead, I should reap all the advantages of a native one. Though such a delicacy of sentiments did not extremely belong to my character at that time, I confess, against myself, that I perhaps too readily closed with a proposal which my candour and ingenuity gave me some repugnance to, but not enough to contradict the intention of one to whom I had now thoroughly abandoned the direction of all my steps. For Mrs. Cole had, I do not know how, unless by one of those unaccountable, invincible sympathies that, nevertheless, form the strongest links, especially of female friendship, won and got entire possession of me. On her side she pretended that a strict resemblance she fancied she saw in me to an only daughter whom she had lost at my age, was the first motive of her taking to me so affectionately as she did. It might be so. There exist as slender motives of attachment that, gathering force from habit and liking, have proved often more solid and durable than those founded on much stronger reasons. But this I know, that though I had no other acquaintance with her than seeing her at my lodgings when I lived with Mr. H., where she had made errands to sell me some millinery ware, she had by degrees insinuated herself so far into my confidence that I threw myself blindly into her hands, and came at length to regard, love, and obey her implicitly, and, to do her justice, I never experienced at her hands other than a sincerity of tenderness, and care for my interest, hardly heard of in those of her profession. We parted that night, after having settled a perfect unreserved agreement, and the next morning Mrs. Cole came and took me with her to her house, for the first time. Here, at the first sight of things, I found everything breathed an air of decency, modesty, and order. In the outer parlour, or rather shop, sat 3 young women, very demurely employed on millinery work, which was the cover of a traffic in more precious commodities, but 3 beautifuller creatures could hardly be seen. 2 of them were extremely fair, the eldest not above 19, and the third, much about that age, was a piquant brunette, whose black sparkling eyes and perfect harmony of features and shape left her nothing to envy in her fairer companions. Their dress, too, had the more design in it, the less it appeared to have, being in a taste of uniform correct neatness and elegant simplicity. These were the girls that composed the small domestic flock, which my governess trained up with surprising order and management, considering the giddy wildness of young girls once got upon the loose. But then she never continued any in her house whom, after a due novitiate, she found untractable, or unwilling to comply with the rules of it. Thus had she insensibly formed a little family of love, in which the members found so sensibly their account, in a rare alliance of pleasure with interest, and of a necessary outward decency with unbounded secret liberty, that Mrs. Cole, who had picked them as much for their temper as their beauty, governed them with ease to herself and them too. To these new pupils, then, of hers, whom she had prepared, she presented me as a new boarder, and one that was to be immediately admitted to all the intimacies of the house, upon which these charming girls gave me all the marks of a welcome reception, and indeed of being perfectly pleased with my figure, that I could possibly expect from any of my own sex. But they had been effectually brought to sacrifice all jealousy or competition of charms to a common interest, and considered me a partner that was bringing no despicable stock of goods into the trade of the house. They gathered round me, viewed me on all sides, and as my admission into this joyous troop made a little holiday, the show of work was laid aside, and Mrs. Cole, giving me up with special recommendation to their caresses and entertainment, went about her ordinary business of the house. The sameness of our sex, age, profession, and views soon created as unreserved a freedom and intimacy as if we had been for years acquainted. They took and showed me the house, their respective apartments, which were furnished with every article of conveniency and luxury, and above all a spacious drawing-room, where a select revelling band usually met, in general parties of pleasure, the girls supping with their sparks, and acting their wanton pranks with unbounded licentiousness, whilst a defiance of awe, modesty, or jealousy were their standing rules, by which, according to the principles of their society, whatever pleasure was lost on the side of sentiment was abundantly made up to the senses in the poignancy of variety, and the charms of ease and luxury. The authors and supporters of this secret institution would, in the height of their humours, style themselves the restorers of the golden age and its simplicity of pleasures, before their innocence became so unjustly branded with the names of guilt and shame. As soon then as the evening began, and the show of a shop was shut, the academy opened, the mask of mock modesty was completely taken off, and all the girls delivered over to their respective calls of pleasure or interest with their men, and none of that sex was promiscuously admitted, but only such as Mrs. Cole was previously satisfied with their character and discretion. In short, this was the safest, politest, and, at the same time, the most thorough house of accommodation in town, everything being conducted so that decency made no entrenchment upon the most libertine pleasures, in the practice of which, too, the choice familiars of the house had found the secret so rare and difficult of reconciling even all the refinements of taste and delicacy with the most gross and determinate gratifications of sensuality. After having consumed the morning in the endearments and instructions of my new acquaintance, we went to dinner, when Mrs. Cole, presiding at the head of her club, gave me the first idea of her management and address in inspiring these girls with so sensible a love and respect for her. There was no stiffness, no reserve, no airs of pique or little jealousies, but all was unaffectedly gay, cheerful, and easy. After dinner, Mrs. Cole, seconded by the young ladies, acquainted me that there was a chapter to be held that night in form for the ceremony of my reception into the sisterhood, and in which, with all due reserve to my maidenhead, that was to be occasionally cooked up for the first proper chapman, I was to undergo a ceremonial of initiation they were sure I should not be displeased with. Embarked as I was, and moreover captivated with the charms of my new companions, I was too much prejudiced in favour of any proposal they could make, too much as hesitate an assent, which, therefore, readily giving in the style of a carte blanche, I received fresh kisses of compliment from them all, in approval of my docility and good nature. Now I was a sweet girl. I came into things with a good grace. I was not affectedly coy. I should be the pride of the house, and the like. This point thus adjusted, the young women left Mrs. Cole to talk and concert matters with me. She explained to me that I should be introduced that very evening to 4 of her best friends, one of whom she had, according to the custom of the house, favoured with the preference of engaging me in the first party of pleasure, assuring me, at the same time, that they were all young gentlemen agreeable in their persons, and unexceptionable in every respect, that united, and holding together by the band of common pleasures, they composed the chief support of her house, and made very liberal presents to the girls that pleased and humoured them, so that they were, properly speaking, the founders and patrons of this little seraglio. Not but that she had, at proper seasons, other customers to deal with, whom she stood less upon punctilio with than with these. For instance, it was not on one of them she could attempt to pass me for a maid. They were not only too knowing, too much town-bred, to bite at such a bait, but they were such generous benefactors to her that it would be unpardonable to think of it. Amidst all the flutter and emotion which this promise of pleasure, for such I conceived it, stirred up in me, I preserved so much of the woman as to feign just reluctance enough to make some merit of sacrificing it to the influence of my patroness, whom I likewise, still in character, reminded of it perhaps being right for me to go home and dress, in favour of my first impressions. But Mrs. Cole, in opposition to this, assured me that the gentlemen I should be presented to were, by their rank and taste of things, infinitely superior to the being touched with any glare of dress or ornaments, such as silly women rather confound and overlay than set off their beauty with, that these veteran voluptuaries knew better than not to hold them in the highest contempt. They with whom the pure native charms alone could pass current, and who would at any time leave a sallow, washy, painted duchess on her own hands, for a ruddy, healthy, firm-fleshed country maid, and as for my part, that nature had done enough for me to set me above owing the least favour to art, concluding withal that for the instant occasion there was no dress like an undress. I thought my governess too good a judge of these matters not to be easily overruled by her, after which she went on preaching very pathetically the doctrine of passive obedience and not resistance to all those arbitrary tastes of pleasure, which are by some styled the refinements and by others the deprivations of it, between whom it was not the business of a simple girl, who was to profit by pleasing, to decide, but to conform to. Whilst I was edifying by these wholesome lessons, tea was brought in, and the young ladies, returning, joined company with us. After a great deal of mixed chat, frolic, and humour, one of them, observing that there would be a good deal of time on hand before the assembly hour, proposed that each girl should entertain the company with that critical period of her personal history in which she first exchanged the maiden state for womanhood. The proposal was approved, with only one restriction of Mrs. Cole, that she, on account of her age, and I, on account of my titular maidenhead, should be excused, at least till I had undergone the forms of the house. This obtained me a dispensation, and the promotress of this amusement was desired to begin. Her name was Emily, a girl fair to excess, and whose limbs were, if possible, too well made, since their plump fullness was rather to the prejudice of that delicate slimness required by the nicer judges of beauty. Her eyes were blue, and streamed inexpressible sweetness, and nothing could be prettier than her mouth and lips, which closed over a range of the evenest and whitest teeth. Thus she began. Neither my extraction nor the most critical adventure of my life is sublime enough to impeach me of any vanity in the advancement of the proposal you have approved of. My father and mother were, and, for aught I know, are still, farmers in the country, not above 40 miles from town. Their barbarity to me, in favour of a son on whom only they vouchsafed to bestow their tenderness, had 1,000 times determined me to fly their house, and throw myself on the wide world, but, at length, an accident forced me on this desperate attempt at the age of 15. I had broken a china bowl, the pride and idol of both their hearts, and as an unmerciful beating was the least I had to depend on at their hands, in the silliness of those tender years I left the house, and, at all adventures, took the road to London. How my loss was resented I do not know, for till this instant I have not heard a syllable about them. My whole stock was 2 broad pieces of my grandmother's, a few shillings, silver shoe-buckles, and a silver thimble. Thus equipped, with no more clothes than the ordinary ones I had on my back, and frightened at every foot or noise I heard behind me, I hurried on, and I dare swear walked 12 miles before I stopped, through mere weariness and fatigue. At length I sat down on a stile, wept bitterly, and yet was still rather under increased impressions of fear on the account of my escape, which made dread worse than death the going back to face my unnatural parents. Refreshed by this little repose, and relieved by my tears, I was proceeding onward, when I was overtaken by a sturdy country lad, who was going to London to see what he could do for himself there, and, like me, had given his friends the slip. He could not be above 17, was ruddy, well-featured enough, with uncombed flaxen hair, a little flapped hat, kersey frock, yarn stockings, in short, a perfect ploughboy. I saw him come whistling behind me with a bundle tied to the end of a stick, his travelling equipage. We walked by one another for some time without speaking. At length we joined company, and agreed to keep together till we got to our journey's end. What his designs or ideas were, I know not. The innocence of mine I can solemnly protest. As night drew on, it became us to look out for some inn or shelter, to which perplexity another was added, and that was, what should we say for ourselves if we were questioned? After some puzzle, the young fellow started a proposal which I thought the finest that could be. And what was that? Why, that we should pass for husband and wife. I never once dreamed of consequences. We came presently, after having agreed on this notable expedient, to one of those hedge accommodations for foot passengers, at the door to which stood an old crazy beldam, who, seeing us trudge by, invited us to lodge there. Glad of any cover, we went in, and my fellow-traveller, taking all upon him, called for what the house afforded, and we supped together as man and wife, which, considering our figures and ages, could not have passed on any one but such as anything could pass on. But when bedtime came on, we had neither of us the courage to contradict our first account of ourselves, and what was extremely pleasant, the young lad seemed as perplexed as I was, how to evade lying together, which was so natural for the state we had pretence to. Whilst we were in this quandary, the landlady takes the candle and lights us to our apartment, through a long yard, at the end of which it stood, separate from the body of the house. Thus we suffered ourselves to be conducted, without saying a word in opposition to it, and there, in a wretched room, with a bed answerable, we were left to pass the night together, as a thing quite of course. For my part, I was so incredibly innocent as not even then to think much more harm of going to bed with the young man than with one of our dairy wenches, nor had he, perhaps, any other notions than those of innocence, till such a fair occasion put them into his head. Before either of us undressed, however, he put out the candle, and the bitterness of the weather made it a kind of necessity for me to go into bed. Slipping then my clothes off, I crept under the bedclothes, where I found the young stripling already nestled, and the touch of his warm flesh rather pleased than alarmed me. I was indeed too much disturbed with the novelty of my condition to be able to sleep, but then I had not the least thought of harm. But oh, how powerful are the instincts of nature! How little is there wanting to set them in action! The young man, sliding his arm under my body, drew me gently towards him, as if to keep himself and me warmer, and the heat I felt from joining our breasts kindled another that I had hitherto never felt, and was, even then, a stranger to the nature of. Emboldened, I suppose, by my easiness, he ventured to kiss me, and I insensibly returned it without knowing the consequence of returning it, for on this encouragement he slipped his hand all down from my breast to that part of me where the sense of feeling is so exquisitely critical, as I then experienced by its instant taking fire upon the touch, and glowing with a strange tickling heat. There he pleased himself and me by feeling, till, growing a little too bold, he hurt me and made me complain. Then he took my hand, which he guided, not unwillingly on my side, between the twist of his closed thighs, which were extremely warm. There he lodged and pressed it, till, raising it by degrees, he made me feel the proud distinction of his sex from mine. I was frightened at the novelty, and drew back my hand. Yet, pressed and spurred on by sensations of a strange pleasure, I could not help asking him what that was for. He told me he would show me if I would let him, and, without waiting for my answer, which he prevented by stopping my mouth with kisses, I was far from disrelishing, he got upon me, and inserting one of his thighs between mine, opened them so as to make way for himself, and fixed me to his purpose, whilst I was so much out of my usual sense, so subdued by the present power of a new one, that, between fear and desire, I lay utterly passive, till the piercing pain roused and made me cry out. But it was too late. He was too firm fixed in the saddle for me to compass flinging him, with all the struggles I could use, some of which only served to further his point, and at length an irresistible thrust murdered at once my maidenhead and almost me. I now lay a bleeding witness of the necessity imposed on our sex to gather the first honey off the thorns. But the pleasure rising as the pain subsided, I was soon reconciled to fresh trials, and before morning nothing on earth could be dearer to me than this rifler of my virgin sweets. He was everything to me now. How we agreed to join fortunes, how we came up to town together, where we lived some time, till necessity parted us, and drove me into this course of life, in which I had been long ago battered and torn to pieces before I came to this age, as much through my easiness as through my inclination, had it not been for my finding refuge in this house. These are all circumstances which pass the mark I proposed, so that here my narrative ends. In the order of our sitting it was Harriet's turn to go on. Amongst all the beauties of our sex that I had before or have since seen, few indeed were the forms that could dispute excellence with hers. It was not delicate, but delicacy itself incarnate, such was the symmetry of her small but exactly fashioned limbs. Her complexion, fair as it was, appeared yet more fair from the effect of two black eyes, the brilliancy of which gave her face more vivacity than belonged to the colour of it, which was only defended from paleness by a sweetly pleasing blush in her cheeks, that grew fainter and fainter, till at length it died away insensibly into the overbearing white. Then her miniature features joined to finish the extreme sweetness of it, which was not belied by that of temper turned to indolence, languor, and the pleasures of love. Pressed to subscribe her contingent, she smiled, blushed a little, and thus complied with our desires. My father was neither better nor worse than a miller near the city of York, and both he and my mother dying whilst I was an infant, I fell under the care of a widow and childless aunt, housekeeper to my Lord —, at his seat in the county of —, where she brought me up with all imaginable tenderness. I was not 17, as I am not now 18, before I had, on account of my person purely, for fortune I had notoriously none, several advantageous proposals. But whether nature was slow in making me sensible in her favourite passion, or that I had not seen any of the other sex who had stirred up the least emotion or curiosity to be better acquainted with it, I had, till that age, preserved a perfect innocence, even of thought, whilst my fears of I did not well know what made me no more desirous of marrying than of dying. My aunt, good woman, favoured my timorousness, which she looked on as childish affection, that her own experience might probably assure her would wear off in time, and gave my suitors proper answers for me. The family had not been down at that seat for years, so that it was neglected and committed entirely to my aunt and two old domestics to take care of it. Thus I had the full range of a spacious lonely house and gardens, situate at about half a mile distance from any other habitation, except, perhaps, a straggling cottage or so. Here in tranquillity and innocence I grew up without any memorable accident, till one fatal day I had, as I had often done before, left my aunt fast asleep and secure for some hours after dinner, and resorting to a kind of ancient summer-house, at some distance from the house, I carried my work with me, and sat over a rivulet, which its door and window faced upon. Here I fell into a gentle breathing slumber, which stole upon my senses, as they fainted under the excessive heat of the season at that hour. A cane couch, with my work-basket for a pillow, were all the conveniences of my short repose, for I was soon awaked and alarmed by a flounce and the noise of splashing in the water. I got up to see what was the matter, and what indeed should it be but the son of a neighbouring gentleman, as I afterwards found, for I had never seen him before, who had strayed that way with his gun, and, heated by his sport, and the sultriness of the day, had been tempted by the freshness of the clear stream, so that presently stripping he jumped into it on the other side, which bordered on a wood, some trees whereof inclined down to the water, formed a pleasing shady recess, commodious to undress and leave his clothes under. My first emotions at the sight of this youth, naked in the water, were, with all imaginable respect to truth, those of surprise and fear, and, in course, I should immediately have run out, had not my modesty, fatally for itself, interposed the objection of the door and window being so situated that it was scarce possible to get out and make my way along the bank of the house without his seeing me, which I could not bear the thought of, so much ashamed and confounded was I at having seen him. Condemned then to stay till his departure should release me, I was greatly embarrassed how to dispose of myself. I kept some time betwixt terror and modesty, even from looking through the window, which being an old-fashioned casement, without any light behind me, could hardly betray anyone's being there to him from within. Then the door was so secure that, without violence or my own consent, there was no opening it from without. But now, by my own experience, I found it too true that objects which affright us, when we cannot get from them, draw our eyes as forcibly as those that please us. I could not long withstand that nameless impulse which, without any desire of this novel sight, compelled me towards it. Emboldened too by my certainty of being at once unseen and safe, I ventured by degrees to cast my eyes on an object so terrible and alarming to my virgin modesty as a naked man. But as I snatched a look, the first gleam that struck me was in general the dewy lustre of the whitest skin imaginable, which the sun playing upon made the reflection of it perfectly beamy. His face, in the confusion I was in, I could not well distinguish the lineaments of, any farther than that there was a great deal of youth and freshness in it. The frolic and various play of all his polished limbs, as they appeared above the surface, in the course of his swimming or wantoning with the water, amused and insensibly delighted me. Sometimes he lay motionless on his back, water-borne, and dragging after him a fine head of hair that, floating, swept the stream in a bush of black curls. Then the overflowing water would make a separation between his breast and glossy white belly, at the bottom of which I could not escape observing so remarkable a distinction as a black mossy tuft, out of which appeared to emerge a round, softish, limber, white something, that played every way, with ever the least motion or whirling eddy. I cannot say but that part chiefly, by a kind of natural instinct, attracted, detained, captivated my attention. It was out of the power of all my modesty to command my eye away from it, and seeing nothing so very dreadful in its appearance, I insensibly locked away all my fears. But as fast as they gave way, new desires and strange wishes took place, and I melted as I gazed. The fire of nature, that had so long lain dormant or concealed, began to break out, and made me feel my sex the first time. He had now changed his posture, and swam prone on his belly, striking out with his legs and arms, finer modelled than which could not have been cast, whilst his floating locks played over a neck and shoulders whose whiteness they delightfully set off. Then the luxuriant swell of flesh that rose from the small of his back, and terminated its double cope at where the thighs are sent off, perfectly dazzled one with its watery, glistening gloss. By this time I was so affected by this inward involution of sentiments, so softened by this sight, that now, betrayed into a sudden transition from extreme fears to extreme desires, I found these last so strong upon me, the heat of the weather too perhaps conspiring to exalt their rage, that nature almost fainted under them. Not that I so much as knew precisely what was wanting to me, My only thought was that so sweet a creature as this youth seemed to me could only make me happy, but then, the little likelihood there was of compassing an acquaintance with him, or perhaps of ever seeing him again, dashed my desires, and turned them into torments. I was still gazing with all the powers of my sight on this bewitching object, when, in an instant, down he went. I had heard of such things as a cramp seizing on even the best swimmers, and occasioning their being drowned, and imagining this so sudden eclipse to be owing to it, the inconceivable fondness this unknown lad had given birth to distracted me with the most killing terrors, insomuch that my concern giving the wings, I flew to the door, opened it, ran down to the canal, guided thither by the madness of my fears for him, and the intense desire of being an instrument to save him, though I was ignorant how, or by what means to effect it. But was it for fears and a passion so sudden as mine to reason? All this took up scarce the space of a few moments. I had then just life enough to reach the green borders of the water-piece, where, wildly looking round for the young man, and missing him still, my fright and concern sunk me down in a deep swoon, which must have lasted me some time, for I did not come to myself till I was roused out of it by a sense of pain that pierced me to the vitals, and awakened me to the most surprising circumstance of finding myself not only in the arms of this very same young gentleman I had been so solicitous to save, but taken at such an advantage in my unresisting condition that he had actually completed his entrance into me so far, that weakened as I was by all the preceding conflicts of mind I had suffered, and struck dumb by the violence of my surprise, I had neither the power to cry out nor the strength to disengage myself from his strenuous embraces, before, urging his point, he had forced his way and completely triumphed over my virginity, as he might now as well see by the streams of blood that followed his drawing out, as he had felt by the difficulties he had met with consummating his penetration. But the sight of the blood and the sense of my condition had, as he told me afterwards, since the ungovernable rage of his passion was somewhat appeased, now wrought so far on him that at all risks, even of the worst consequences, he could not find in his heart to leave me and make off, which he might easily have done. I still lay all discomposed in bleeding ruin, palpitating, speechless, unable to get off, and frightened, and fluttering like a poor wounded partridge, and ready to faint away again at the sense of what had befallen me. The young gentleman was by me, kneeling, kissing my hand, and with tears in his eyes beseeching me to forgive him, and offering all the reparation in his power. It is certain that could I, at the instant of regaining my senses, have called out, or taken the bloodiest revenge, I would not have struck at it. The violation was attended to with such aggravating circumstances, though he was ignorant of them, since it was to my concern for the preservation of his life that I owed my ruin. But how quick is the shift of passions from one extreme to another, and how little are they acquainted with the human heart who dispute it! I could not see this amiable criminal, so suddenly the first object of my love, and as suddenly of my just hate, on his knees, bedewing my hand with his tears, without relenting. He was still stark naked, but my modesty had been already too much wounded, in essentials, to be so much shocked as I should have otherwise been with appearances only. In short, my anger ebbed so fast, and the tide of love returned so strong upon me, that I felt it a point of my own happiness to forgive him. The reproaches I made him were murmured in so soft a tone, my eyes met his with such glances, expressing more languor than resentment, that he could not but presume his forgiveness was at no desperate distance, but still he would not quit his posture of submission, till I had pronounced his pardon in form, which after the most fervent entreaties, protestations, and promises, I had not the power to withhold. On which, with the utmost marks of a fear of again offending, he ventured to kiss my lips, which I neither declined nor resented, but on my mild expostulations with him upon the barbarity of his treatment, he explained the mystery of my ruin, if not entirely to the clearance, at least much to the alleviation of his guilt, in the eyes of a judge so partial in his favour as I was grown. It seems that the circumstance of his going down or sinking, which in my extreme ignorance I had mistaken for something very fatal, was no other than a trick of diving which I had not ever heard, or at least attended to the mention of, and he was so long-breathed at it, that in the few moments in which I ran out to save him, he had not yet emerged, before I fell into the swoon, in which, as he rose, seeing me extended on the bank, his first idea was that some young woman was upon some design of a frolic or diversion with him, for he knew I could not have fallen asleep there without his having seen me before; agreeably to which notion he had ventured to approach, and finding me without sign of life, and still perplexed as he was what to think of the adventure, he took me in his arms at all hazards, and carried me into the summer-house, of which he observed the door open. There he laid me down on the couch, and tried, as he protested in good faith, by several means to bring me to myself again, till fired, as he said, beyond all bearing by the sight and touch of several parts of me which were unguardedly exposed to him, he could no longer govern his passion, and the less, as he was not quite sure that his first idea of this swoon being a feint was not the very truth of the case. Seduced then by this flattering notion, and overcome by the present, as he styled them, superhuman temptations, combined with the solitude and seeming security of the attempt, he was not enough his own master not to make it. Leaving me then just only whilst he fastened the door, he returned with redoubled eagerness to his prey, when, finding me still entranced, he ventured to place me as he pleased, whilst I felt, no more than the dead, what he was about, till the pain he put me to roused me just in time enough to be witness of a triumph I was not able to defeat, and now scarce regretted, for as he talked, the tone of his voice sounded, methought, so sweetly in my ears, the sensible nearness of so new and interesting an object to me wrought so powerfully upon me, that, in the rising perception of things in a new and pleasing light, I lost all sense of the past injury. The young gentleman soon discerned the symptoms of a reconciliation in my softened looks, and hastening to receive the seal of it from my lips, pressed them tenderly to pass his pardon in the return of a kiss so melting fiery, that the impression of it being carried to my heart, and thence to my new discovered sphere of Venus, I was melted into a softness that could refuse him nothing. When now he managed his caresses and endearments so artfully as to insinuate the most soothing consolations for the past pain, and the most pleasing expectations of future pleasure, but whilst mere modesty kept my eyes from seeing his and rather declined them, I had a glimpse of that instrument of the mischief which was now, obviously even to me, who had scarce had snatches of a comparative observation of it, resuming its capacity to renew it, and grew greatly alarming with its increase of size, as he bore it no doubt designedly, hard and stiff against one of my hands, carelessly dropped. But then he employed such tender prefacing, such winning progressions, that my returning passion of desire being now so strongly prompted by the engaging circumstances of the sight and incendiary touch of his naked glowing beauties, I yielded at length the force of the present impressions, and he obtained of my tacit blushing consent all the gratifications of pleasure left in the power of my poor person to bestow, after he had cropped its richest flower, during my suspension of life and abilities to guard it. Here, according to the rule laid down, I should stop, but I am so much in motion that I could not if I would. I shall only add, however, that I got home without the least discovery or suspicion of what had happened. I met my young ravisher several times after, whom I now passionately loved, and who, though not of age to claim a small but independent fortune, would have married me, but as the accidents that prevented it, and their consequences which threw me on the public, contain matters too moving and serious to introduce at present, I cut short here. Louisa, the brunette whom I mentioned at first, now took her turn to treat the company with her history. I have already hinted to you the graces of her person, than which nothing could be more exquisitely touching. I repeat touching, as a just distinction from striking, which is ever a less lasting effect, and more generally belongs to the fair complexions. But leaving that decision to every one's taste, I proceed to give you Louisa's narrative, as follows. According to practical maxims of life, I ought to boast of my birth, since I owe it to pure love, without marriage, but this I know, it was scarce possible to inherit a stronger propensity to that cause of my being than I did. I was the rare production of the first essay of a journeyman cabinet-maker upon his master's maid, the consequence of which was a big belly and the loss of a place. He was not in circumstances to do much for her, and yet, after all this blemish, she found means, after she had dropped her burthen, and disposed of me to a poor relation's in the country, to repair it by marrying a pastry cook here in London, in thriving business, on whom she soon, under favour of the complete ascendant he had given her over him, passed me for a child she had by her first husband. I had on that footing been taken home, and was not 6 years old when this stepfather died, and left my mother in tolerable circumstances, and without any children by him. As to my natural father, he had betaken himself to the sea, where, when the truth of things came out, I was told that he died, not immensely rich, you may think, since he was no more than a common sailor. As I grew up under the eyes of my mother, who kept on the business, I could not but see, in her severe watchfulness, the marks of a slip which she did not care should be hereditary. But we no more choose our passions than our features or complexion, and the bent of mine was so strong to the forbidden pleasure, that it got the better, at length, of all her care and precaution. I was scarce 12 years old before that part which she wanted so much to keep out of harm's way made me feel its impatience to be taken notice of, and come into play. Already had it put forth the signs of forwardness, in the sprout of a soft down over it, which had often flattered, and I might also say grown under my constant touch and visitation, so pleased was I with what I took to be a kind of title to womanhood. That state I pined to be entered of, for the pleasures I conceived were annexed to it. And now the growing importance of that part to me, and the new sensations in it, demolished at once all my girlish playthings and amusements. Nature now pointed me strongly to more solid diversions, while all the stings of desire settled so fiercely in that little centre of them, that I could not mistake the spot I wanted a playfellow in. I now shunned all company in which there was no hopes of coming at the object of my longings, and used to shut myself up, to indulge in solitude some tender meditation on the pleasures I strongly perceived the overture of, in feeling and examining what nature assured me must be the chosen avenue, the gates for unknown bliss to enter at, that I panted after. But these meditations only increased my disorder, and blew the fire that consumed me. I was yet worse when, yielding at length to the insupportable irritations of the little fairy charm that tormented me, I seized it with my fingers, teasing it to no end. Sometimes in the furious excitations of desire I threw myself on the bed, spread my thighs abroad, and lay as it were expecting the longed-for relief, till, finding my illusion, I shut and squeezed them together again, burning and fretting. In short, this devilish thing, with its impetuous girds and itching fires, led me such a life that I could neither night nor day be at peace with it or myself. In time, however, I thought I had gained a prodigious prize, when figuring to myself that my fingers were something of the shape of what I pined for, I worked my way in for one of them with great agitation and delight. Yet not without pain too did I deflower myself as far as it could reach, proceeding with such a fury of passion in this solitary and last shift of pleasure, as extended me at length breathless on the bed in an amorous melting trance. But frequency of use dulling the sensation, I soon began to perceive that this work was but a paltry shallow expedient that went but a little way to relieve me, and rather raised more flame than its dry and insignificant titillation could rightly appease. Man alone, I almost instinctively knew, as well as by what I had industriously picked up at weddings and christenings, was possessed of the only remedy that could reduce this rebellious disorder, but watched and overlooked as I was, how to come at it was the point, and that, to all appearance, an invincible one. Not that I did not rack my brains and invention how at once to elude my mother's vigilance, and procure myself the satisfaction of my impetuous curiosity and longings for this mighty and untasted pleasure. At length, however, a singular chance did at once the work of a long course of alertness. One day that we had dined at an acquaintance's over the way, together with a gentlewoman lodger that occupied the first floor of our house, there started an indispensable necessity for my mother's going down to Greenwich to accompany her. The party was settled, when I do not know what genius whispered me to plead a headache, which I certainly had not, against my being included in a jaunt that I had not the least relish for. The pretext, however, passed, and my mother, with much reluctance, prevailed with herself to go without me, but took particular care to see me safe home, where she consigned me into the hands of an old trusty maidservant, who served in the shop, for we had not a male creature in the house. As soon as she was gone, I told the maid I would go up and lie down on our lodger's bed, mine not being made, with a charge to her at the same time not to disturb me, as it was only rest I wanted. This injunction probably proved of eminent service to me. As soon as I was got into the bedchamber, I unlaced my stays, and threw myself on the outside of the bedclothes, in all the loosest undress. Here I gave myself up to the old insipid privy shifts of my self-viewing, self-touching, self-enjoying, in fine to all the means of self-knowledge I could devise, in search of the pleasure that fled before me, and tantalized with that unknown something that was out of my reach. Thus all only served to enflame myself, and to provoke violently my desires, whilst the one thing needful to their satisfaction was not at hand, and I could have bit my fingers for representing it so ill. After then wearying and fatiguing myself with grasping shadows, whilst that most sensible part of me disdained to content itself with less than realities, the strong yearnings, the urgent struggles of nature towards the melting relief, and the extreme self-agitations I had used to come at it, had wearied and thrown me into a kind of unquiet sleep. For if I tossed and threw about my limbs in proportion to the distraction of my dreams, as I had reason to believe I did, a bystander could not have helped seeing all for love. And one there was, it seems, for waking out of my very short slumber, I found my hand locked in that of a young man, who was kneeling at my bedside, and begging my pardon for his boldness, but that being a son to the lady to whom this bedchamber, he knew, belonged, he had slipped by the servant of the shop, as he supposed, unperceived, when finding me asleep, his first ideas were to withdraw. but that he had been fixed and detained there by a power he could better account for than resist. What shall I say? My emotions of fear and surprise were instantly subdued by those of the pleasure I bespoke in great presence of mind from the turn this adventure might take. He seemed to me no other than a pitying angel dropped out of the clouds, for he was young and perfectly handsome, which was more than even I had asked for, man in general being all that my utmost desires had pointed at. I thought then I could not put too much encouragement into my eyes and voice. I regretted no leading advances, no matter for his after opinion of my forwardness, so it might bring him to the point of answering my pressing demands of my present case. It was not now with his thoughts but his actions that my business immediately lay. I raised then my head, and told him, in a soft tone that tended to prescribe the same key to him, that his mamma was gone out, and would not return till late at night, which I thought no bad hint, but as it proved I had nothing of a novice to deal with. The impressions I had made on him from the discoveries I had betrayed of my person in the disordered motions of it, during his view of me asleep, had, as he afterwards told me, so fixed and charmingly prepared him, that, had I known his dispositions, I had more to hope from his violence than to fear from his respect, and even less than the extreme tenderness which I threw into my voice and eyes would have served to encourage him to make the most of the opportunity. Finding then that his kisses, imprinted on my hand, were taken as tamely as he could wish, he rose to my lips, and gluing his to them made me so faint with overcoming joy and pleasure that I fell back, and he with me, in course on the bed, upon which I had, by insensibly shifting from the side to near the middle, invitingly made room for him. He is now lain down by me, and the minutes being too precious to consume in untimely ceremony, or dalliance, my youth proceeds immediately to those extremities which all my looks, flushing and palpitations had assured him he might attempt without the fear of repulse. Those rogues, the men, read us admirably on these occasions. I lay then at length panting for the imminent attack, with wishes far beyond my fears, and for which it was scarce possible for a girl, barely 13, but all and well grown, to have better dispositions. He threw up my petticoat and shift, whilst my thighs were, by an instinct of nature, unfolded to their best, and my desires had so thoroughly destroyed all modesty in me, that even their being now naked and all laid open to him was part of the prelude that pleasure deepened my blushes at, more than shame. But when his hand and touches, naturally attracted to their centre, made me feel all their wantonness and warmth in, and round it, oh, how immensely different a sense of things did I perceive there, than when under my own insipid handling. And now his waistcoat was unbuttoned, and the confinement of the breeches burst through, when out started to view the amazing, pleasing object of all my wishes, all my dreams, all my love, the king member indeed. I gazed at, I devoured it at length and breadth, with my eyes intently directed to it, till his getting upon me and placing it between my thighs took from me the enjoyment of its sight, to give me a far more grateful one in its touch, in that part where its touch is so exquisitely affecting. Applying it then to the minute opening, for such at that age it certainly was, I met with too much goodwill, I felt with too great a rapture of pleasure the first insertion of it, to heed much the pain that followed. I thought nothing too dear to pay for this the richest treat of the senses, so that, split up, torn, bleeding, mangled, I was still superiorly pleased, and hugged the author of all this delicious ruin. But when, soon after, he made his second attack, sore as everything was, the smart was soon put away by the sovereign cordial. All my soft complainings were silenced, and the pain melting fast away into pleasure. I abandoned myself over to all its transports, and gave it the full possession of my whole body and soul, for now all thought was at an end with me. I lived but in what I felt only. And who could describe those feelings, those agitations, yet exalted by the charm of their novelty and surprise? When that part of me which had so long hungered for the dear morsel that now so delightfully crammed it, forced all my vital sensations to fix their home there during the stay of my beloved guest, who too soon paid me for his hearty welcome in a dissolvent, richer far than that I have heard of some queen treating her paramour with, in liquefied pearl, and ravishingly poured into me, where, now myself too much melted to give it a dry reception, I hailed it with the warmest confluence on my side, amidst all those ecstatic raptures, not unfamiliar, I presume, to this good company. Thus, however, I arrived at the very top of all my wishes, by an accident unexpected indeed, but not so wonderful, for this young gentleman was just arrived in town from college, and came familiarly to his mother at her apartment, where he had once before been, though by mere chance. I had not seen him, so that we knew one another by hearsay only, and finding me stretched on his mother's bed, he readily concluded, from her description, who it was. The rest you know. This affair had, however, no ruinous consequences, the young gentleman escaping then, and many more times undiscovered. But the warmth of my constitution, that made the pleasures of love a kind of necessary of life to me, having betrayed me into indiscretions fatal to my private fortune, I fell at length to the public, from which, it is probable, I might have met with the worst of ruin, if my better fate had not thrown me into this safe and agreeable refuge. Here Louisa ended, and these little histories having brought the time for the girls to retire, and to prepare for the revels of the evening, I stayed with Mrs. Cole till Emily came, and told us the company was met, and waited for us. End of Part 6. Read by Kara Schallenberg on March 24th, 2006, in Oceanside, California.
Fanny Hill, Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure, by John Cleland. Part 7. On the landing place of the first pair of stairs we were met by a young gentleman, extremely well dressed, and a very pretty figure, to whom I was to be indebted for the first essay of the pleasures of a house. He saluted me with great gallantry, and handed me into the drawing-room, the floor of which was overspread with the Turkey carpet, and all its furniture voluptuously adapted to every demand of the most studied luxury. Now too it was, by means of a profuse illumination, enlivened by a light scarce inferior, and perhaps more favourable to joy, more tenderly pleasing, than that of broad sunshine. On my entrance into the room, I had the satisfaction to hear a buzz of approbation run through the whole company, which now consisted of 4 gentlemen, including my particular. This was the cant term of the house for one's gallant for the time. The 3 young women in a sweet, flowing dishabille, the mistress of the academy, and myself. I was welcomed and saluted by a kiss all around, in which, however, it was easy to discover, in the superior warmth of that of the men, the distinction of the sexes. Awed and confounded as I was at seeing myself surrounded, caressed, and made court to by so many strangers, I could not immediately familiarize myself to all that air of gaiety and joy which dictated their compliments and animated their caresses. They assured me that I was so perfectly to their taste as to have but one fault against me, which I might easily be cured of, and that was my modesty. This, they observed, might pass for a beauty, the more with those who wanted it for a heightener, but their maxim was, that it was an impertinent mixture, and dashed the cup so as to spoil the sincere draught of pleasure. They considered it, accordingly, as their mortal enemy, and gave it no quarter whenever they met with it. This was a prologue not unworthy of the revels that ensued. In the midst of all the frolic and wantonness which this joyous band had presently, and all naturally, run into, an elegant supper was served in, and we sat down to it, my spark elect placing himself next to me, and the other couples without order or ceremony. The delicate cheer and good wine soon banished all reserve. The conversation grew as lively as could be wished, without taking too loose a turn. These professors of pleasure knew too well to stale impressions of it, or evaporate the imagination in words before the time of action. Kisses, however, were snatched at times, or where a handkerchief round the neck interposed its feeble barrier, it was not extremely respected. The hands of the men went to work with their usual petulance, till the provocations on both sides rose to such a pitch that my particular's proposal for beginning the country dances was received with instant assent, for, as he laughingly added, he fancied the instruments were in tune. This was a signal for preparation that the complaisant Mrs. Cole, who understood life, took her cue of disappearing, no longer so fit for personal service herself, and content with having settled the order of battle, she left us the field to fight it out at discretion. As soon as she was gone, the table was removed from the middle and became a sideboard. A couch was brought into its place, of which, when I whisperingly inquired the reason of my particular, he told me that, as it was on my account chiefly that this convention was met, the parties intended at once to humour their taste of variety in pleasures, and, by an open public enjoyment, to see me broke of any taint of reserve or modesty, which they looked on as the poison of joy; that, though they occasionally preached pleasure and lived up to the text, they did not enthusiastically set up for missionaries, and only indulged themselves in the delights of a practical instruction of all the pretty women they liked well enough to bestow it upon, and who fell properly in the way of it; but that, as such a proposal might be too violent, too shocking for a young beginner, the old standers were to set an example, which he hoped I would not be averse to follow, since it was to him I was devolved in favour of the first experiment, but that still I was perfectly at my liberty to refuse the party, which, being in its nature one of pleasure, supposed an exclusion of all force or constraint. My countenance expressed, no doubt, my surprise as my silence did my acquiescence. I was now embarked and thoroughly determined on any voyage the company would take me on. The first that stood up, to open the ball, was a cornet of horse, and that sweetest of olive beauties, the soft and amorous Louisa. He led her to the couch, nothing loath, on which he gave her the fall, and extended her at her length with an air of roughness and vigour, relishing high of amorous eagerness and impatience. The girl, spreading herself to the best advantage, with her head upon the pillow, was so concentred in what she was about, that our presence seemed the least of her care and concern. her petticoats thrown up with her shift, discovered to the company the finest turned legs and thighs that could be imagined, and in broad display they gave us a full view of that delicate cleft of flesh into which the pleasing hair-grown mount over it parted and presented a most inviting entrance between two close hedges, delicately soft and pouting. Her gallant was now ready, having disencumbered himself from his clothes, overloaded with lace, and presently his shirt removed, showed us his forces in high plight, bandied and ready for action. But giving us no time to consider the dimensions, he threw himself instantly over his charming antagonist, who received him, as he pushed at once dead at mark, like a heroine, without flinching. For surely never was girl constitutionally truer to the taste of joy, or sincerer in the expressions of its sensations, than she was. We could observe pleasure lighten in her eyes as he introduced his plenipotentiary instrument into her, till at length, having indulged her to its utmost reach, its irritations grew so violent, and gave her the spurs so furiously, that, collected within herself, and lost to everything but the enjoyment of her favourite feelings, she retorted his thrusts with a just concert of springy heaves, keeping time so exactly with the most pathetic sighs that one might have numbered the strokes in agitation by their distinct murmurs, whilst her active limbs kept wreathing and intertwisting with his in convulsive folds. Then the turtle-billing kisses and the poignant, painless love-bites which they both exchanged in a rage of delight, all conspiring towards the melting period. It soon came on when Louisa, in the ravings of her pleasure-frenzy, impotent of all restraint, cried, "O good sir, pray do not spare me! Ah, ah!" all her accents now faltering into heart-fetched sighs. She closed her eyes in the sweet death, in the instant of which she was embalmed by an injection of which we could easily see the signs in the quiet, dying, languid posture of her late so furious driver, who was stopped of a sudden, breathing short, panting, and, for the time, giving up the spirit of pleasure. As soon as he was dismounted, Louisa sprung up, shook her petticoats, and running up to me gave me a kiss and drew me to the sideboard, to which she was herself handled by her gallant, where they made me pledge them in a glass of wine and toast a droll health of Louisa's proposal in high frolic. By this time the second couple was ready to enter the lists, which were a young baronet and that delicatest of charmers, the winning, tender Harriet. My gentle esquire came to acquaint me with it, and brought me back to the scene of action. And surely never did one of her profession accompany her dispositions for the barefaced part she was engaged to play with such a peculiar grace of sweetness, modesty, and yielding coyness as she did. All her air and motions breathed only unreserved, unlimited complaisance, without the least mixture of impudence or prostitution. But what was yet more surprising, her spark elect, in the midst of the dissolution of a public open enjoyment, doted on her to distraction, and had, by dint of love and sentiments, touched her heart, though for a while the restraint of their engagement to the house laid him under a kind of necessity of complying with an institution which himself had had the greatest share in establishing. Harriet was then led to the vacant couch by her gallant, blushing as she looked at me, and with eyes made to justify anything, tenderly bespeaking of me the most favorable construction of the step she was thus irresistibly drawn into. Her lover, for such he was, sat her down at the foot of the couch, and passing his arm round her neck, preluded with a kiss fervently applied to her lips that visibly gave her life and spirit to go through with the scene. And as he kissed, he gently inclined her head till it fell back on a pillow disposed to receive it, and leaning himself down all the way with her, at once countenanced and endeared her fall to her. There, as if he had guessed our wishes, or meant to gratify at once his pleasure and his pride in being the master, by the title of present possession, of beauties delicate beyond imagination, he discovered her breasts to his own touch and our common view. But oh, what delicious manuals of love devotion, how inimitable, fine moulded, small, round, firm, and excellently white, the grain of their skin so soothing, so flattering to the touch, and their nipples that crowned them, the sweetest buds of beauty. When he had feasted his eyes with the touch and perusal, feasted his lips with kisses of the highest relish, imprinted on those all delicious twin orbs, he proceeded downwards. Her legs still kept the ground, and now with the tenderest attention not to shock or alarm her too suddenly, he by degrees rather stole than rolled up her petticoats, at which, as if a signal had been given, Louisa and Emily took hold of her legs in pure wantonness, and, in ease to her, kept them stretched wide abroad. Then lay exposed, or, to speak more properly, displayed, the greatest parade in nature of female charms. The whole company, who, except myself, had often seen them, seemed as much dazzled, surprised, and delighted as anyone could be who had now beheld them for the first time. Beauties so excessive could not but enjoy the privileges of eternal novelty. Her thighs were so exquisitely fashioned that, either more in or more out of flesh than they were, they would have declined from that point of perfection they presented. But what infinitely enriched and adorned them was the sweet intersection formed, where they met, at the bottom of the softest, smoothest, whitest belly, by that central furrow which nature had sunk there, between the soft relief of two pouting ridges, and which in this was in perfect symmetry of delicacy and miniature with the rest of her frame. No, nothing in nature could be of a beautifuler cut. Then the dark umbrage of the downy spring moss that overarched it bestowed on the luxury of the landscape a touching warmth, a tender finishing beyond the expression of words, or even the paint of thought. Her truly enamored gallant, who had stood absorbed and engrossed by the pleasure of the sight long enough to afford us time to feast ours, no fear of glutting, addressed himself at length to the materials of enjoyment, and lifting the linen veil that hung between us and his master member of the revels, exhibited one whose eminent size proclaimed the owner a true woman's hero. He was, besides, in every other respect an accomplished gentleman, and in the bloom and vigour of youth. Standing then between Harriet's legs, which were supported by her two companions at their widest extension. With one hand he gently disclosed the lips of that luscious mouth of nature, whilst with the other he stooped his mighty machine to its lure, from the height of his stiff stand-up towards his belly. The lips, kept open by his fingers, received its broad, shelving head of coral hue, and when he had nestled in it, he hovered there a little, and the girls then delivered over to his hips the agreeable office of supporting her thighs. And now, as if meant to spin out his pleasure and give it the more play for its life, he passed up his instrument so slow that we lost sight of it inch by inch, till at length it was wholly taken into the soft laboratory of love, and the mossy mounts of each fairly met together. In the meantime we could plainly mark the prodigious effect the progressions of this delightful energy wrought in this delicious girl, gradually heightening her beauty as they heightened her pleasure. Her countenance and whole frame grew more animated, the faint blush of her cheeks, gaining ground on the white, deepened into a florid, vivid vermilion glow. Her naturally brilliant eyes now sparkled with tenfold lustre. Her languor was vanished, and she appeared quick-spirited and alive all over. He now fixed, nailed, this tender creature with his home-driven wedge, so that she lay passive by force and unable to stir, till, beginning to play a strain of arms against this vein of delicacy as he urged the to and fro confriction, he awakened, roused, and touched her so to the heart that, unable to contain himself, she could not but reply to his motions as briskly as her nicety of frame would admit of, till the raging stings of the pleasure rising towards the point made her wild with the intolerable sensations of it, and she now threw her legs and arms about at random, as she lay lost in the sweet transport, which on his side declared itself by quicker, eager thrusts, convulsive gasps, burning sighs, swift, laborious breathings, eyes darting humid fires, all faithful tokens of the imminent approach of the last gasp of joy. It came on at length. The baronet led the ecstasy, which she critically joined in, as she felt the melting symptoms from him, in the nick of which, gluing more ardently than ever his lips to hers, he showed all the signs of that agony of bliss being strong upon him, in which he gave her the finishing titillation, inly thrilled with which we saw plainly that she answered it down with all effusion of spirit and matter she was mistress of, whilst a general soft shudder ran through all her limbs, which she gave a stretch out of, and lay motionless, breathless, dying with the dear delight, and in the height of its expression, showing through the nearly closed lids of her eyes just the edges of their black, the rest being rolled strongly upwards in their ecstasy. Then her sweet mouth appeared languishingly open, with the tip of her tongue leaning negligently towards the lower range of her white teeth, whilst the natural ruby colour of her lips glowed with heightened life. Was not this a subject to dwell upon? And, accordingly, her lover still kept on her with an abiding delectation, till compressed, squeezed, and distilled to the last drop, he took leave with one fervent kiss, expressing satisfied desires, but unextinguished love. As soon as he was off, I ran to her, and sitting down on the couch by her, raised her head, which she declined gently, and hung on my bosom, to hide her blushes and confusion at what had passed, till by degrees she recomposed herself and accepted of a restorative glass of wine from my spark, who had left me to fetch it for her, whilst her own was readjusting his affairs and buttoning up, after which he led her, leaning languishingly upon him, to our stand of view round the couch. And now Emily's partner had taken her out for her share in the dance, when this transcendently fair and sweet-tempered creature readily stood up, and if a complexion to put the rose and lily out of countenance, extreme pretty features, and that florid health and bloom for which the country girls are so lovely, might pass her for a beauty, this she certainly was, and one of the most striking of the fair ones. Her gallant began first, as she stood, to disengage her breasts and restore them to the liberty of nature, from the easy confinement of no more than a pair of jumps. But on their coming out to view, we thought a new light was added to the room, so superiorly shining was their whiteness. Then they rose in so happy a swell as to compose her a well-formed fullness of bosom, that had such an effect on the eye as to seem flesh hardening into marble, of which it emulated the polished gloss, and far surpassed even the whitest in the life and lustre of its colours, white veined with blue. Refrain who could from such provoking enticements to it in reach. He touched her breasts, first lightly, when the glossy smoothness of the skin eluded his hand, and made it slip along the surface. He pressed them, and the springy flesh that filled them, thus pitted by force, rose again reboundingly with his hand, and on the instant effaced the pressure. And alike indeed was the consistence of all those parts of her body throughout, where the fullness of flesh compacts and constitutes all that fine firmness which the touch is so highly attached to. When he had thus largely pleased himself with this branch of dalliance and delight, he trussed up her petticoat and shift in a wisp to her waist, where, being tucked in, she stood fairly naked on every side. A blush at this overspread her lovely face, and her eyes, downcast to the ground, seemed to be for quarter, when she had so great a right to triumph in all the treasures of youth and beauty that she now so victoriously displayed. Her legs were perfectly well shaped, and her thighs, which she kept pretty close, showed so white, so round, so substantial and abounding in firm flesh, that nothing could offer a stronger recommendation to the luxury of the touch, which he accordingly did not fail to indulge himself in. Then, gently removing her hand, which in the first emotion of natural modesty she had carried thither, he gave us rather a glimpse than a view of that soft, narrow chink running in its length downwards, and hiding the remains of it between her thighs. But plain was to be seen the fringe of light brown curls in beauteous growth over it, that with their silky gloss creating a pleasing variety from the surrounding white, whose lustre too their gentle embrowning shade considerably raised. Her spark then endeavoured, as she stood, by disclosing her thighs, to gain us a completer sight of that central charm of attraction, but, not obtaining it so conveniently in that attitude, he led her to the foot of the couch, and bringing to it one of the pillows, gently inclined her head down, so that, as she leaned with it over her crossed hands, straddling with her thighs widespread, and jutting her body out, she presented a full, back view of her person, naked to the waist. Her posteriors, plump, smooth, and prominent, formed luxuriant tracts of animated snow that splendidly filled the eye till it was commanded down the parting or separation of those exquisitely white cliffs by their narrow vale, and was there stopped and attracted by the embowered bottom cavity that terminated this delightful vista and stood moderately gaping from the influence of her bended posture, so that the agreeable interior red of the sides of the orifice came into view, and with respect to the white that dazzled round it, gave somewhat the idea of a pink slash in the glossiest white satin. Her gallant, who was a gentleman about 30, somewhat inclined to a fatness that was in no sort displeasing, improving the hint thus tendered him in this mode of enjoyment, after settling her well in this posture and encouraging her with kisses and caresses to stand him through, drew out his affair ready erected, and whose extreme length, rather disproportioned to its breadth, was the more surprising, as that excess is not often the case with those of his corpulent habit. Making then the right and direct application, he drove it up to the guard, whilst the round bulge of those Turkish beauties of hers, tallying with the hollow made with the bent of his belly and thighs, as they curved inwards, brought all those parts, surely not undelightfully, into warm touch and close conjunction, his hands as he kept passing round her body, and employed in toying with her enchanting breasts. As soon, too, as she felt him at home as he could reach, she lifted her head a little from the pillow, and turning her neck, without much straining, but her cheeks glowing with the deepest scarlet, and a smile of the tenderest satisfaction, met the kiss as he pressed forward to give her, as they were thus closely joined together. When leaving him to pursue his delights, she hid again her face and blushes with her hands in pillow, and thus stood passively and as favourably too as she could, whilst he kept laying at her with repeated thrusts, and making the flesh meeting on both sides resound again with the violence of them. Then, ever as he backened from her, he could see between them part of his long white staff foamingly in motion, till, as he went on again and closed with her, the interposing hillocks took it out of sight. Sometimes he took his hands from the semi-globes of her bosoms and transferred the pressure of them to those larger ones, the present subjects of his soft blockade, which he squeezed, grasped, and played with, till at length a pursuit of driving so hotly urged brought on the height of the fit, and with such overpowering pleasure that his fair partner became now necessarily to support him, panting, fainting, and dying as he discharged, which she no sooner felt the killing sweetness of, than, unable to keep her legs, and yielding to the mighty intoxication, she reeled, and falling forward on the couch, made it a necessity for him, if he would preserve the warm pleasure-hold, to fall upon her, where they perfected in a continued conjunction of body and ecstatic flow their scheme of joys for that time. As soon as he had disengaged, the charming Emily got up, and we crowded round her with congratulations and other officious little services, for it is to be noted that, though all modesty and reserve were banished from the transaction of these pleasures, good manner and politeness were inviolably observed. Here was no gross ribaldry, no offensive or rude behavior or ungenerous reproaches to the girls for their compliance and the humors and desires of the men. On the contrary, nothing was wanting to soothe, encourage, and soften the sense of their condition to them. Men know not in general how much they destroy of their own pleasure when they break through the respect and tenderness due to our sex, and even to those of it who live only by pleasing them. And this was a maxim perfectly well understood by these polite voluptuaries, these profound adepts in the great art and science of pleasure, who never showed these votaries of theirs a more tender respect than at the time of those exercises of their complaisance, when they unlocked their treasures of concealed beauty, and showed out in the pride of their native charms, ever more touching surely than when they paraded it in the artificial ones of dress and ornament. The frolic was now come round to me, and it being my turn of subscription to the will and pleasure of my particular elect, as well as to that of the company, he came to me, and saluting me very tenderly with a flattering eagerness, put me in mind of the compliances my presence there authorized the hopes of, and at the same time repeated to me that if all this force of example had not surmounted any repugnance I might have to concur with the humours and desires of the company, that though the play was bespoke for my benefit, and great as his own private disappointment might be, he would suffer anything sooner than be the instrument of opposing a disagreeable task upon me. To this I answered, without the least hesitation or mincing grimace, that had I not even contracted a kind of engagement to be at his disposal without the least reserve, the example of such agreeable companions would alone determine me, and that I was in no pain about any thing but my appearing to so great a disadvantage after such superior beauties. And take notice that I thought as I spoke. The frankness of the answer pleased them all. My particular was complimented on his acquisition, and, by way of indirect flattery to me, openly envied. Mrs. Cole, by the way, could not have given me a greater mark of her regard than in managing for me the choice of this young gentleman for my master of ceremonies. For, independent of his noble birth and the great fortune he was heir to, his person was even uncommonly pleasing, well-shaped and tall, his face marked with the smallpox, but no more than what added a grace of more manliness to features rather than turned to softness and delicacy, was marvellously enlivened by eyes which were of the clearest sparkling black. In short, he was one whom any woman would, in the familiar style, readily call a very pretty fellow. I was now handed by him to the cockpit of our match. Here, as I was dressed in nothing but a white morning gown, he vouchsafed to play the male Abigail on this occasion, and spared me the confusion that would have attended the forwardness of undressing myself. My gown then was loosened in a trice, and I divested of it. My stay next offered an obstacle which readily gave way, Louisa very readily furnishing a pair of scissors to cut the lace. Off went that shell, and dropping my outer coat, I was reduced to my under one, and my shift, the open bosom of which gave the hands and eyes all the liberty they could wish. Here I imagined the stripping was to stop, but I reckoned short. My spark, at the desire of the rest, tenderly begged that I would not suffer the small remains of a covering to rob them of a full view of my whole person, and for me, who was too flexibly obsequious to dispute any point with them, and who considered the little more that remained as very immaterial, I readily assented to whatever he pleased. In an instant, then, my under petticoat was untied and at my feet, and my shift drawn over my head so that my cap, slightly fastened, came off with it, and brought all my hair down, of which be it again remembered, without vanity, that I had a very fine head, in loose disorderly ringlets over my neck and shoulders, to the not unfavourable set off of my skin. I now stood before my judges in all the truth of nature, to whom I could not appear, a very disagreeable feature, if you please to recollect what I have before said of my person, which time, that at certain periods of life robs us every instant of our charms, had, at that of mine, then greatly improved into full and open bloom, for I wanted some months of 18. My breasts, which in the state of nudity are ever capital points, now in no more than in graceful plenitude, maintained a firmness and steady independence of any stay or support that dared and invited the test of the touch. Then I was as tall, as slim-shaped as could be consistent with all that juicy plumpness of flesh, ever the most grateful to the senses of sight and touch, which I owed to the health and youth of my constitution. I had not, however, so thoroughly renounced all innate shame as not to suffer great confusion at the state I saw myself in, but the whole troop round me, men and women, relieved me with every mark of applause and satisfaction, every flattering attention to raise and inspire me with even sentiments of pride on the figure I made, which, my friend gallantly protested, infinitely outshone all other birthday finery whatever; so that had I leave to set down for sincere all the compliments these connoisseurs overwhelmed me with upon this occasion, I might flatter myself with having passed my examination with the approbation of the learned. My friend, however, who for this time had alone the disposal of me, humoured their curiosity, and perhaps his own, so far that he placed me in all the variety of postures and lights imaginable, pointing out every beauty under every aspect of it, not without such parentheses of kisses, such inflammatory liberties of his roving hands, as made all shame fly before them, and a blushing glow give place to a warmer one of desire, which led me even to find some relish in the present scene. But in this general survey, you may be sure, the most material spot of me was not excused the strictest visitation, nor was it but agreed that I had not the least reason to be diffident of passing even for a maid on occasion. So inconsiderable a flaw had my preceding adventures created there, and so soon had the blemish of an overstretch been repaired and worn out at my age, and in my naturally small make in that part. Now, whether my partner had exhausted all the modes of regaling the sight or touch, or whether he was now ungovernably wound up to strike, I know not, but briskly throwing off his clothes, the prodigious heat bred by a close room, a great fire, numerous candles, and even the inflammatory warmth of these scenes, induced him to lay aside his shirt too, when his breeches, before loosened, now gave up their contents to view, and showed in front the enemy I had to engage with, stiffly bearing up the port of its head unhooded and glowing red. Then I plainly saw what I had to trust to. It was one of those just, true-sized instruments of which the masters have a better command than the more unwieldy, inordinate-sized ones are generally under. Straining me then close to his bosom, as he stood up foreright against me, and applying to the obvious niche its particular idol, he aimed at inserting it, which, as I forwardly favoured, he effected at once by canting up my thighs over his naked hips, and made me receive every inch and close home, so that, stuck upon the pleasure pivot and clinging round his neck, in which and in his hair I hid my face, burningly flushing with my present feelings as much as with shame, my bosom glued to his, he carried me once round the couch, on which he then, without quitting the middle fastness or dischannelling, laid me down and began the pleasure grist. But so provokingly predisposed and primed as we were by all the moving sights of the night, our imagination was too much heated up not to melt us of the soonest, and accordingly I no sooner felt the warm spray darted up my inwards from him, but I was punctually on flow to share the momentary ecstasy. But I had even greater reason to boast of our harmony, for finding that all the flames of desire were not yet quenched within me, but that rather like whetted coals, I glowed the fiercer for this sprinkling, my hot mettled spark, sympathizing with me, and loaded for a double fire, recontinued the sweet battery with undying vigour, greatly pleased, at which I gratefully endeavoured to accommodate all my motions to his best advantage and delight. Kisses, squeezes, tender murmurs, all came into play, till our joys, growing more turbulent and riotous, threw us into a fond disorder, and as they raged to a point, bore us far from ourselves into an ocean of boundless pleasures, into which we both plunged together in a transport of taste. Now all the impressions of burning desire, from the lively scenes I had been spectatress of, ripened by the heat of this exercise and collecting to a head, throbbed and agitated me with insupportable irritations. I did not now enjoy a calm of reason enough to perceive, but I ecstatically, indeed, felt the power of such rare and exquisite provocatives as the examples of the night had proved towards thus exalting our pleasures, which with great joy I sensibly found my gallant shared in by his nervous and home expressions of it, his eyes flashing eloquent flames, his action infuriated with the stings of it, all conspiring to rise my delight by assuring me of his. Lifted then to the utmost pitch of joy that human life can bear, undestroyed by excess, I touched that sweetly critical point whence, scarce prevented by the injection from my partner, I dissolved, and breaking out into a deep drawn sigh, sent my whole sensitive soul down to that passage where escape was denied it, by its being so deliciously plugged and choked up. Thus we lay a few blissful instants, overpowered, still, and languid, till, as the sense of pleasure stagnated, we recovered from our trance, and he slipped out of me, not however before he had protested his extreme satisfaction by the tenderest kiss and embrace, as well as by the most cordial expressions. The company, who had stood round us in a profound silence, when all was over, helped me to hurry on my clothes in an instant, and complimented me on the sincere homage they could not escape observing had been done, as they termed it, to the sovereignty of my charms, in my receiving a double payment of tribute at one juncture. But my partner, now dressed again, signalized, above all, a fondness unabated by the circumstances of recent enjoyment. The girls, too, kissed and embraced me, assuring me that for that time, or indeed any other, unless I pleased, I was to go through no farther public trials, and that I was now consummately initiated, and one of them. As it was an inviolable law for every gallant to keep his partner, for the night especially, and even till he relinquished possession over to the community, in order to preserve a pleasing property and to avoid the disgusts and indelicacy of another arrangement, the company, after a short refection of biscuits and wine, tea and chocolate, served in at now about 1 in the morning, broke up and went off in pairs. Mrs. Cole had prepared my spark and me an occasional field bed, to which we retired, and there ended the night in one continued strain of pleasure, sprightly and uncloyed enough for us not to have formed one wish for its ever knowing an end. In the morning, after a restorative breakfast in bed, he got up, and with very tender assurances of a particular regard for me, left me to the composure and refreshment of a sweet slumber, waking out of which, and getting up to dress before Mrs. Cole should come in, I found in one of my pockets a purse of guineas, which he had slipped there, and just as I was musing on a liberality I had certainly not expected, Mrs. Cole came in, to whom I immediately communicated the present, and naturally offered her whatever share she pleased, but assuring me that the gentleman had very nobly rewarded her, she would on no terms, no entreaties, no shape I could put it in, receive any part of it. Her denial, she observed, was not affectation of grimace, and proceeded to read me such admirable lessons on the economy of my person and my purse as I became amply paid for my general attention and conformity to in the course of my acquaintance with the town. After which, changing the discourse, she fell on the pleasures of the preceding night, where I learned, without much surprise, as I began to enter on her character, that she had seen every thing that had passed, from a convenient place managed solely for that purpose, and of which she readily made me the confidant. She had scarce finished this when the little troop of love, the girls, my companions, broke in and renewed their compliments and caresses. I observed with pleasure that the fatigues and exercises of the night had not usurped in the least on the life of their complexion or the freshness of their bloom. This, I found by their confession, was owing to the management and advice of our rare directress. They went down then to figure it, as usual, in the shop, whilst I repaired to my lodgings, where I employed myself till I returned to dinner at Mrs. Cole's. Here I stayed in constant amusement with one or other of these charming girls till about 5 in the evening, when, seized with a sudden drowsy fit, I was prevailed on to go up and doze it off on Harriet's bed, who left me on it to my repose. There then I lay down my clothes and fell fast asleep, and had now enjoyed, by guess, about an hour's rest, when I was pleasingly disturbed by my new and favourite gallant, who, inquiring for me, was readily directed where to find me. Coming then into my chamber, and seeing me lie alone, with my face turned from the light towards the inside of the bed, he, without more ado, just slipped off his breeches, for the greater ease and enjoyment of the naked touch, and softly turning up my petticoat and shift behind, opened the prospect of the back avenue to the genial seat of pleasure, where, as I lay at my side length, inclining rather face downward, I appeared full fair and liable to be entered. Laying himself then gently down by me, he invested me behind, and giving me to feel the warmth of his body as he applied his thighs and belly close to me, and the endeavours of that machine, whose touch has something so exquisitely singular to it, to make its way good into me, I waked pretty much startled at first, but seeing who it was, disposed myself to turn to him, when he gave me a kiss, and desiring me to keep my posture, just lifted up my upper thigh, and ascertaining the right opening, soon drove it up to the farthest, satisfied with which, and solacing himself with lying so close in those parts, he suspended motion, and thus steeped in pleasure, kept me lying on my side, into him, spoon fashion, as he termed it, from the snug indent of the back part of my thighs, and all upwards into the space of the bending between his thighs and belly, till after some time that restless and turbulent inmate, impatient by nature of longer quiet, urged him to action, which, now prosecuting with all the usual train of toying, kissing, and the like, ended at length in the liquid proof on both sides that we had not exhausted, or at least were quickly recruited of, last night's draughts of pleasure in us. With this noble and agreeable youth lived I in perfect joy and constancy. He was full bent on keeping me to himself, for the honey month at least, but his stay in London was not even so long, his father, who had a post in Ireland, taking him abruptly with him on his repairing thither. Yet even then I was near keeping hold of his affection in person as he had proposed, and I had consented to follow him in order to go to Ireland after him, as soon as he could be settled there. But, meeting with an agreeable and advantageous match in that kingdom, he chose the wiser part, and forbore sending for me, but at the same time took care that I should receive a very magnificent present, which did not however compensate for all my deep regret on my loss of him. This event also created a chasm in our little society, which Mrs. Cole, on the foot of her usual caution, was in haste to fill up. But then it redoubled her efforts to procure me, in the advantages of a traffic for a counterfeit maidenhead, some consolation for the sort of widowhood I had been left in, and this was a scheme she had never lost prospect of, and only waited for a proper person to bring it to bear with. But I was, it seems, fated to be my own caterer in this, as I had been in my first trial of the market. I had now passed near a month in the enjoyment of all the pleasures of familiarity and society with my companions, whose particular favourites, the baronet excepted, who soon after took Harriet home, had all, on the terms of community established in the house, solicited the gratification of their taste for variety in my embraces. But I had with the utmost art and address, on various pretexts, eluded their pursuit, without giving them cause to complain, and this reserve I used neither out of dislike of them or disgust of the thing, but my true reason was my attachment to my own, and my tenderness of invading the choice of my companions, who, outwardly exempt, as they seemed, from jealousy, could not but, in secret, like me the better for the regard I had for, without making a merit of it to them. Thus easy and beloved by the whole family did I go on, when one day, that about 5 in the afternoon, I stepped over to a fruiterer's shop in Covent Garden to pick some table fruit for myself and the young women. I met with the following adventure. Whilst I was chaffering for the fruit I wanted, I observed myself followed by a young gentleman whose rich dress first attracted my notice. For the rest, he had nothing remarkable in his person, except that he was pale, thin-made, and ventured himself upon legs rather of the slenderest. Easy was it to perceive, without seeming to perceive it, that it was me he wanted to be at, and keeping his eyes fixed on me till he came to the same basket that I stood at, and cheapening, or rather giving the first price asked for the fruit, began his approaches. Now, most certainly, I was not at all out of figure to pass for a modest girl. I had neither the feathers nor fumette of a tawdry town miss, a straw hat, a white gown, clean linen, and above all, a certain natural and easy air of modesty, which the appearances of never forsook me, even on those occasions that I most broke in upon it in practice, were all signs that gave him no opening to conjecture my condition. He spoke to me, and this address, from a stranger throwing a blush into my cheeks that still set him wider off the truth, I answered him with an awkwardness and confusion the more apt to impose, as there was really a mixture of the genuine in them. But when proceeding, on the foot of having broken the ice to join discourse, he went into other leading questions, I put so much innocence, simplicity, and even childishness into my answers, that on no better foundation, liking my person as he did, I will answer for it, he would have been sworn for my modesty. There is, in short, in the men, when once they are caught, by the eye especially, a fund of gullibility that their lordly wisdom little dreams of, and in virtue of which the most sagacious of them are seen so often our dupes. Amongst other queries he put to me, one was whether I was married. I replied that I was too young to think of that this many a year. To that of my age I answered, and sunk a year upon him, passing myself for not 17. As to my way of life, I told him I had served an apprenticeship to a milliner in Preston, and was come to town after a relation that I had found on my arrival was dead, and now lived journeywoman to a milliner in town. That last article, indeed, was not much of the side of what I pretended to pass for, but it did pass under favour of the growing passion I inspired with him. After he had next got out of me, very dexterously as he thought, what I had no sort of designs to make reserve of, my mistress' name and place of abode, he loaded me with fruit, all the rarest and dearest he could pick out, and sent me home, pondering on what might be the consequence of this adventure. As soon then as I came to Mrs. Cole's, I related to her all that passed, on which she had very judiciously concluded that if he did not come after me, there was no harm done, and that, if he did, as her presage suggested to her he would, his character and his views should be well sifted, so as to know whether the game was worth the springs; that in the meantime nothing was easier than my part in it, since no more rested on me than to follow her cue and promptership throughout to the last act. The next morning, after an evening spent on his side, as we afterwards learnt, in perquisitions into Mrs. Cole's character in the neighbourhood, than which nothing could be more favourable to her design upon him, my gentleman came in his chariot to the shop, where Mrs. Cole alone had an inkling of his errand. Asking then for her, he easily made a beginning of acquaintance by bespeaking some millinery ware, when, as I sat without lifting up my eyes, and pursuing the hem of a ruffle with the utmost composure and simplicity of industry, Mrs. Cole took notice that the first impressions I made on him ran no risk of being destroyed by those of Louisa and Emily, who were then sitting at work by me. After vainly endeavouring to catch my eyes in re-encounter with his, as I held my head down, affecting a kind of consciousness of guilt for having, by speaking to him, given him encouragement and means of following me, and after giving Mrs. Cole direction when to bring the things home herself, and the time he should expect them, he went out, taking with him some goods which he paid for liberally, for the better grace of his introduction. End of Part 7. Recorded by Denny Sayers in Modesto, California, winter 2006.